Her sneer was as sharp as the crease in her uniform. Standing at the entrance of the first-class cabin flight attendant, Amelia Vance saw not a passenger, but a problem. A man in a worn grey hoodie and scuffed work boots, holding a ticket for seat 2A. In her world of champagne and curated luxury, he was an error, an insult to the airline's prestige. She decided in that split second to teach him a lesson about where he belonged. It was a lesson she would come to regret, for she had no idea she was about to scoff at the very man who now owned her paycheck. Orion Atlantic Airways flight. A nightly behemoth of steel and dreams was more than just a plane. It was a symbol. Specifically, it was the flagship route from New York's JFK to London Heathrow, a 7-hour passage where the destinies of finance, fashion, and power converged at 38,000 feet. For senior flight attendant Amelia Vance, it wasn't a job. It was a stage. At 34, Amelia had cultivated an image as pristine and formidable as the aircraft itself. Her blonde hair was swept into a flawless chignon, not a single strand daring to escape its lacquered hold. Her uniform, a deep navy blue with gold accents, was tailored to perfection, and her smile, though frequent, rarely reached her piercing blue eyes. She had worked for Orion for 12 years, clawing her way up from the crowded aisles of economy to the hushed, carpeted reverence of the first-class cabin. She believed in the hierarchy of the skies. First class wasn't just about a bigger seat. It was about a standard. It was for the tailored suits from Savile Row, the quiet confidence of old money, and the subtle glint of a Patek Philippe watch. Her passengers were not customers. They were members of an exclusive club, and she was their discerning gatekeeper. She prided herself on her ability to spot an imposter a mile away, the lottery winner, on a one-time splurge, the tech bro with more crypto than class, the C-list celebrity desperate for validation. She treated them with a veneer of professional courtesy, but her disdain was a cold undercurrent they could all feel. Tonight the cabin was humming with its usual pedigree. In 1A sat Lord Harrington, a British peer whose family had probably funded the Mayflower. Across the aisle was Isabella Rossi, the Italian heiress to a fashion empire, scrolling through her phone with an air of sublime boredom. The pre-departure champagne, a Bollinger Grande Année, was being poured, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the clean, recycled air. Amelia was in her element, gliding down the aisle, her voice a low, melodious hum. "Can I offer you a warm towel, Miss Rossi?" Another glass of champagne. Lord Harrington. Her junior colleague, a bright-eyed and earnest young woman named Chloe, watched her with a mixture of awe and intimidation. Chloe was only 6 months into the job, still enchanted by the romance of travel and genuinely eager to make passengers comfortable. She found Amelia's rigid demeanor chilling, but tried to learn from her efficiency. Watch and learn, Chloe Amelia had told her during their briefing. First class is about anticipation, not reaction. We are here to provide an invisible, seamless service, and above all, we maintain the standard. No exceptions. The standard was Amelia's gospel. It was a code of conduct she had largely invented herself, a mixture of company policy and her own stringent prejudices. And the first rule of her code was that appearance was everything. As the last of the first-class passengers began to trickle in, Amelia stood at her post near the galley, her eyes scanning the jet bridge. She saw him from a distance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but that was all the physicality she could initially discern. The rest of him was a study in deliberate anonymity. He wore a simple charcoal grey hoodie, the hood pulled down, but the fabric softened by countless washes. His jeans were dark but faded at the knees, and on his feet were a pair of scuffed, well-worn Timberland boots that looked like they had seen more construction sites than airport lounges. He carried no designer carry-on, just a simple unbranded black backpack slung over one shoulder. Amelia's lip curled ever so slightly. Economy, she thought. Probably lost trying to find his middle seat in row 45. But the man didn't turn towards the back of the plane. He walked straight towards her, his eyes scanning the seat numbers with a quiet focus. He clutched a boarding pass in his hand, and as he drew closer, Amelia felt a surge of protective indignation. This was her cabin, her sanctuary of elegance. He stopped in front of her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone that held a surprising resonance. "Just making sure I'm in the right spot." 2A. Amelia took the boarding pass he offered without making eye contact with him, her gaze fixed on the offending document as if it were a forgery. The name read, Marcus Thorne. The seat 2A. First, a cold knot of disbelief tightened in her stomach. It had to be a mistake, an upgrade for a frequent flyer who hadn't had time to change a last-minute booking by an assistant who didn't know any better. She looked up her eyes, finally meeting his. He was a black man, perhaps in his late 40s. His face was clean-shaven, and his features were strong and composed. But it was his eyes that were most striking. They were deep-set, intelligent, and held a quiet, observant stillness. They were not the eyes of someone who was lost or intimidated. They were the eyes of someone who was exactly where he intended to be. And that, to Amelia Vance, was the biggest problem of all. This man didn't just look like he didn't belong. He looked completely unbothered by that fact. Her internal switch flipped from professional gatekeeper to personal enforcer. The standard had been breached, and she was going to correct it. Seat 2A, she repeated her voice, dripping with manufactured sweetness that barely concealed its condescending edge. "Are you sure, sir, economy class is further down the aircraft? Perhaps there's been a mix-up." Marcus Thorne simply held her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. No mix-up. Seat 2A. The battle lines had been drawn on the plush carpet of the first-class cabin, and Amelia, confident in her authority and her judgment, prepared for a swift and decisive victory. The air in the cabin, once a comfortable hum of quiet privilege, suddenly felt charged and heavy. Lord Harrington peered over his newspaper with mild curiosity. Isabella Rossi paused, her scrolling her perfectly manicured thumb hovering over her screen. Chloe, who was arranging magazines nearby, froze, sensing the shift in her superior's tone. Amelia held Marcus Thorne's boarding pass between her thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. "It's just that this is a first-class ticket," she said, enunciating each word slowly, as if speaking to a child or someone who didn't understand the language. "Our first-class cabin has a certain ambiance. We do have a dress code of sorts. It's generally expected." She gestured vaguely at the other passengers, at Lord Harrington's blazer, at the silk blouse Miss Rossi wore. The implication was clear. "You are not dressed for this." Marcus's expression remained placid, but his stillness became more profound. He wasn't rising to the bait. "My apologies," he said, his voice still even. "My luggage with my suits was sent ahead. This was a last-minute trip. Are my clothes preventing the plane from taking off?" The direct logical question seemed to fluster Amelia. Sarcasm, however subtle, was not a language she tolerated from those she deemed beneath her. "Of course not, sir," she said, her voice tightening. "It's simply a matter of decorum. I need to scan your pass again to verify it. Please wait here." She turned on her heel and marched to the galley, her shoes clicking with sharp, indignant taps on the floor. Chloe followed her, her face pale with anxiety. "Amelia, what are you doing?" Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. His pass scanned fine at the gate. "You can't just re-verify him because you don't like his hoodie." You are new here, Chloe." Amelia hissed her back to the cabin as she pretended to fuss with the onboard computer. "You don't understand. We are the face of this airline. If we allow the standards to slip even a little, it all falls apart. He's probably one of those social media influencers who scammed a ticket to make a viral video about flying first class. We have to be firm." "But he seems perfectly polite," Chloe insisted. "What if you're wrong? I am never wrong about this." Amelia snapped, her confidence absolute. She turned back towards Marcus, a triumphant look on her face. "Sir, there appears to be an issue with your ticket in our system. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step off the aircraft while we sort it out with the ground staff." It was a blatant, power-tripping lie. There was no issue. She was simply ejecting him on a whim, banking on the fact that he would be too embarrassed to cause a scene. A low murmur rippled through the cabin. This was no longer a subtle judgment. It was a public shaming. Marcus Thorne stood his ground. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved an inch. He just watched her, his gaze penetrating. It felt to Amelia as if he could see right through her, the years of insecurity, the desperate need for control, the hollow validation she got from her petty acts of authority. "You want me to deplane?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's for the comfort and security of all our passengers," Amelia said, the corporate jargon sounding absurd in the context of her personal crusade. "We need to ensure everyone seated in this cabin is supposed to be here." Before Marcus could respond, a new figure appeared at the entrance to the jet bridge. He was a man in his late 50s. His silver hair impeccably styled his suit, a sharp, tailored grey that screamed executive authority. His face was etched with the familiar stress of a high-powered CEO, but right now it was alight with a warm, deferential smile. It was David Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of Orion Atlantic Airways. Amelia's posture immediately straightened. A visit from the CEO on a flagship flight wasn't unheard of, but it was rare. He must be here for a surprise inspection. A wave of pride washed over her. He was about to see her in action, upholding the very standards he espoused in company-wide memos. "Amelia, everything all right here?" Sterling asked, his eyes briefly flicking over her before locking on to the man in the hoodie. "Mr. Sterling, sir." Amelia said, her voice regaining its professional polish. "Perfectly fine. I was just handling a small ticketing discrepancy with this gentleman." David Sterling's smile didn't falter, but a confused frown creased his brow. He walked past Amelia as if she were a piece of furniture and extended his hand warmly to the man she was trying to eject. Marcus Sterling's voice boomed with genuine delight. "I'm so glad I caught you before we pushed back. I wanted to personally welcome you aboard. We are absolutely thrilled to have you flying with us tonight." Marcus Thorne finally broke his stoic composure, a small wry smile touching his lips as he shook the CEO's hand. "David. Good to see you. I was just being informed there's a problem with my ticket." David Sterling's head whipped around to face Amelia. His warm, welcoming expression vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "A problem," Sterling repeated, his voice dangerously low. "With Mr. Thorne's ticket, Amelia." "What is the meaning of this?" Amelia's mind went blank. The two names, Marcus and David, the handshake, the first-name basis, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid shutting. Her brain frantically searched for an explanation, any explanation that didn't lead to the abyss that was yawning before her. I was just verifying, sir." She stammered the words, feeling like sand in her mouth. "Standard procedure." Sterling ignored her. He turned back to Marcus, his face a mask of mortified apology. Marcus, I am so sorry. Please, your seat. Let me get you settled. Can I get you a drink? A Macallan 25. Perhaps I know it's a favorite of yours. Marcus glanced at Amelia, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment. There was no triumph in his eyes, no anger. There was just a quiet, profound disappointment that was somehow worse than any rage. Then he turned to Sterling. The Macallan sounds perfect, David, he said, before walking calmly to seat 2A, placing his backpack in the overhead bin and sitting down as if nothing had happened. Amelia Vance stood frozen in the aisle. The blood had drained from her face, leaving her with a ghostly chalk-white pallor. Her carefully constructed world, her entire sense of identity, built on judgment and exclusion, had just been demolished by a man in a hoodie. Chloe from the galley watched with wide, terrified eyes. She had heard whispers in the crew lounge rumors about the airline's recent financial troubles and the last-minute buyout that had saved them from bankruptcy. The deal was brokered by a notoriously private but powerful investment firm. A firm called Phoenix Capital Group, led by its enigmatic founder, a self-made billionaire famous for his low profile and his intolerance for corporate arrogance. A man named Marcus Thorne. Amelia hadn't just insulted a passenger. She had tried to eject her new boss, the owner of the entire airline. The heavy cabin door sealed with a pneumatic hiss, shutting Amelia in with her colossal mistake. For the next 7 hours, she would be trapped in a pressurized tube, cruising at 600 miles per hour, with the man who held her entire career in the palm of his hand. The initial shock that had frozen her limbs now gave way to a frantic, nauseating panic that churned in her stomach. David Sterling, the CEO, was still fuming. He pulled Amelia aside into the galley, his face a thunderous mask. He kept his voice to a whisper, but it was laced with a fury that was more terrifying than any shout. Do you have any idea who that is? He seethed, his eyes boring into hers. That is Marcus Thorne, the Marcus Thorne. Phoenix Capital just poured $900 million into this airline last month. They own a 51% controlling stake. He isn't just an investor, Amelia. He is Orion Atlantic now. And you, in your infinite wisdom, just tried to throw him off his own plane because you didn't like his jacket. Amelia's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Every excuse, every justification she could have possibly manufactured died in her throat. There was no talking her way out of this. The sheer monumental scale of her error was crushing her. I didn't know, sir. She finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. He didn't look like what Sterling cut her off, his voice dangerously soft. Like one of the richest, most powerful men in the country. A man who famously dislikes the trappings of wealth. Did you think he'd show up wearing a crown? Your job is to provide exemplary service to every passenger in this cabin, not to run a credit check based on their choice of footwear. You are the senior flight attendant on our flagship route. This is the face of the company we present to the world. And you just spat in it. He took a deep, steadying breath, running a hand through his silver hair. Now here is what is going to happen. You are going to complete this flight. You will be professional, you will be courteous, and you will serve Mr. Thorne with a smile on your face, if it kills you. You will not apologize profusely and make a scene. You will not avoid him. You will do your job. When we land at Heathrow, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. She breathed the words, tasting like ash. Sterling gave her one last withering look before composing himself and returning to Marcus Thorne's seat, where he spent another 10 minutes, engaged in quiet, deferential conversation before returning to his own seat in 1D. Walking back into the cabin was the hardest thing Amelia had ever had to do. The atmosphere had changed. The other passengers who had witnessed the whole exchange now looked at Marcus Thorne with a newfound respect and awe, and at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was no longer the queen of her gilded cage. She was a court jester who had insulted the king. Her body moved on autopilot. She served the pre-flight drinks, her hands shaking so badly she nearly spilled a glass of orange juice on a diplomat's briefcase. When it came time to take the meal order for seat 2A, her heart hammered against her ribs. She approached him, her notepad clutched in her damp palm. "Mr. Thorne." She began her voice, a strained, unnatural version of itself. "May I take your dinner selection? We have the pan-seared halibut or the filet mignon." Marcus Thorne looked up from the financial reports he was reading on his tablet. His face was unreadable. He hadn't gloated, he hadn't complained, he hadn't even mentioned the incident to Sterling in a voice loud enough for her to hear. He was simply existing in his seat, his quiet presence a screaming indictment of her prejudice. "The halibut sounds fine," he said, his tone neutral. "And a sparkling water, please." "Of course, Mr. Thorne," she mumbled and fled back to the galley. Chloe watched her, her young face filled with a sympathy that Amelia felt she didn't deserve. "Let me take care of his service," Amelia Chloe offered gently. "You look like you're going to be sick." "No," Amelia said, straightening her back with a sliver of her old pride. "He's my passenger. I will serve him." It was a penance, she decided, a 7-hour-long walk of shame. The flight dragged on, each minute an eternity. Every time she had to pass his seat, she felt his eyes on her, though he was usually focused on his work. She served him his meal, her hands trembling, as she placed the fine china on his tray table. She refilled his water glass, her movements stiff and clumsy. She was a parody of the graceful, efficient flight attendant she had always prided herself on being. Her over-attentiveness became its own kind of torture. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Thorne?" "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Thorne?" "More water, Mr. Thorne." Finally, after her fourth inquiry in the span of an hour, he looked up from his work and met her gaze directly. "Amelia, is it?" he asked, his voice calm. "Yes, sir, Mr. Thorne." "You can relax," he said, and the simple statement was not a comfort, but a verdict. It meant he saw her panic, her desperate fawning, and was completely unmoved by it. "I don't require any special attention. Just do your job as you would for anyone else." As you would for anyone else. The words hung in the air. But she hadn't, Hashir. She had treated him as less than anyone else. His request for normalcy was the most profound condemnation of her actions. He wasn't asking for an apology or for her to be fired. He was simply holding up a mirror to her behavior, and the reflection was grotesque. For the remainder of the flight, Chloe quietly and efficiently took over. She served Mr. Thorne with a genuine warmth and respect that Amelia could only feign. Chloe talked to him, not as an investor or a VIP, but as a person. She asked him if he needed an extra blanket noticed when his water was low without being asked, and shared a brief, friendly chat about a book he was reading. Marcus, in turn, was warm and engaging with her, smiling and thanking her by name. Amelia watched from the galley, a bitter envy coiling in her gut. She was watching her own obsolescence. Chloe wasn't just doing the job. She was embodying a spirit of service that Amelia had long ago traded for a sense of superiority. As the plane began its descent into London, the fasten seatbelt sign, chiming its final mournful bell for Amelia's career, she finally understood the depth of her miscalculation. She had judged a man by his clothes, a classic foolish mistake. But it was worse than that. She hadn't just misjudged his net worth, she had fundamentally failed to see his humanity. And in the silent, unforgiving world of high-stakes business and service, that was a sin for which there was no easy absolution. The landing gear lowered with a heavy thud, and for Amelia, it sounded like the gavel of a judge delivering a life sentence. London Heathrow greeted them with a cool, grey dawn. As the plane taxied towards Terminal 2, the Queen's terminal, a sense of grim finality settled over Amelia. The charade was over. The engine spooled down the seatbelt sign, pinged off, and the quiet scramble for bags began. Amelia stood at the door, forcing a plastic smile onto her face as she bid farewell to the other first-class passengers. "Goodbye, Lord Harrington. Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Rossi." Each word felt like a lie. When Marcus Thorne approached the exit, David Sterling was at his side, already deep in conversation about logistics for an upcoming board meeting. Marcus paused in the doorway and looked directly at Amelia. For a fleeting second, she thought he might say something, a final word of condemnation, perhaps. Instead, he turned his head slightly towards the galley where Chloe was tidying up. "Chloe," he called out, his voice clear and warm. "Thank you for your exceptional service. You're a credit to this airline." Chloe blushed, looking genuinely pleased. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Thorne. Have a wonderful time in London." He gave her a genuine smile, then turned and walked down the jet bridge with the CEO, not giving Amelia a second glance. It was the most brutal, effective dismissal he could have possibly delivered. He had erased her, rendered her invisible. The senior flight attendant, the self-proclaimed guardian of the cabin, had been completely and utterly upstaged by the junior colleague she had patronized just hours before. As soon as the last passenger was off, a ground operations manager appeared at the door. "Amelia Vance," he asked, his tone brusque. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in the Orion Atlantic corporate office. Now." The walk through the sprawling terminal was a blur. The usual energy of Heathrow, the cacophony of languages, the rolling suitcases, the tearful reunions, was just white noise to Amelia. She felt detached from her own body, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life imploding. She was escorted to a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the executive floor. David Sterling was already there, standing by the window overlooking the airfield, his back to the door. The head of in-flight services for Europe, a stern woman named Eleanor Croft, was seated at the long mahogany table, a file open in front of her. The file had Amelia's name on it. Amelia stood awkwardly in the doorway until Eleanor gestured to the empty chair opposite her. The silence stretched for a full minute, thick with unspoken accusations. Finally, Sterling turned around. His face was no longer angry. It was something worse, cold, clinical, and detached. This was no longer a dressing down. It was a damage assessment. "Sit down, Amelia," he said. She sat her back, ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Eleanor Sterling began, "has been reviewing Ms. Vance's service record." Eleanor Croft pushed the file across the table. 12 years of service, Amelia. On paper exemplary. High marks on performance reviews. Commendations for efficiency, perfect attendance. She paused, tapping a manicured finger on the folder. "But paper doesn't tell the whole story, does it?" Eleanor opened a second file. "In the last 3 hours at my request, our customer relations team has cross-referenced your flight roster for the past 2 years, with passenger complaints that mentioned a blonde senior flight attendant on the JFK LHR route. It's amazing what you can find when you know what you're looking for." She started reading her voice, a flat, unemotional drone. Complaint number 77B41. Passenger claims the flight attendant publicly questioned if he could afford the wine he ordered and made a condescending remark about his accent. Complaint 91C05. A family upgraded to first class using miles were made to feel unwelcome and judged. The flight attendant allegedly told the children to keep their voices down as this isn't a playground. Complaint 104A32. Passenger alleges the flight attendant suggested his wheelchair would be in the way and showed visible annoyance when assisting him. On and on it went. A dozen incidents, all anonymous, all previously dismissed as isolated grumbles from difficult passengers. But now put together they painted a damning portrait. It was a clear, undeniable pattern of prejudice and elitism. The encounter with Marcus Thorne wasn't an anomaly. It was the culmination of her entire work philosophy. Amelia felt the last of her defenses crumble. She had always told herself these people were the problem, too sensitive, too demanding, not accustomed to the standards of luxury. Now, in this cold, quiet room, she was forced to see that the problem had always been her. Marcus Thorne is a very private man, Sterling said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He didn't demand we fire you. He didn't scream or threaten lawsuits. He's far too sophisticated for that. He did something much more devastating. After I left him, he sent me a single text message. Sterling held up his phone and read it aloud. David, your most valuable asset is your front-line staff. Some of them are outstanding. Others are a significant liability to your brand and our investment. I trust you will handle the liabilities. He put the phone down. He didn't make it personal. He made it a business problem, a liability. In his world, you don't get angry at liabilities. You just cut them loose. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full and final investigation. Eleanor Croft stated her tone, leaving no room for appeal. You will surrender your company ID and credentials. You will be escorted from the premises. A flight will be arranged to return you to New York tomorrow. In economy. The final word was delivered with a quiet, deliberate cruelty that mirrored Amelia's own. It was a perfectly symmetrical piece of karmic justice. She would be flown back across the ocean she once ruled, stripped of her wings, relegated to the very class of passenger she had so long despised. Amelia didn't plead or argue. She was a liability, and liabilities were a silent drag on a balance sheet. She had been weighed, she had been measured, and she had been found wanting. As she was led out of the office, she caught a glimpse of the airfield through the large window. An Orion Atlantic 807 Dreamliner was majestically taking off, climbing gracefully into the clouds, leaving her behind on the ground. The flight back to New York was the most humiliating 8 hours of Amelia's life. Seated in a middle seat, 38B, wedged between a snoring businessman and a restless college student, she was just another anonymous passenger. The flight attendants, her former colleagues, treated her with a cold, professional distance. They knew. Of course they knew. News in the airline world travels faster than the planes themselves. The story of the flight attendant who tried to kick the new owner off the plane was already becoming a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in galleys and crew lounges across the globe. Landing at JFK, an airport she once strode through with an air of authority, felt different. She was no longer part of the intricate clockwork of the aviation industry. She was just a civilian lost in the crowd. Her apartment, once a sanctuary that overlooked the twinkling lights of Queens, now felt like a prison. The navy blue uniform with its gold accents hung in her closet, a mocking reminder of the life and identity she had lost. The full and final investigation was a swift formality. 2 weeks after her suspension, a sterile, legally vetted termination letter arrived by courier. The reason cited was a consistent failure to adhere to the company's core values of inclusivity and customer respect. Her pattern of complaints, now corroborated, formed an ironclad case against her. There would be no severance package beyond her contractual dues. Amelia's world began to unravel with terrifying speed. Without her substantial salary and travel benefits, her expensive lifestyle became an anchor, dragging her down. The lease on her luxury apartment, the payments on her designer clothes, the brunch dates with her equally status-obsessed friends. It was all predicated on an income that no longer existed. She tried to find another job. She had 12 years of experience with a major international carrier. On paper, she was a prime candidate. But the industry was a small, incestuous world. Her name, Amelia Vance, was now unofficially blacklisted. She applied to every major US and European airline. The rejections came back with chilling efficiency. Some didn't reply at all. One recruiter, in a moment of unguarded pity, told her off the record. No one wants to risk hiring the flight attendant who insulted Marcus Thorne. It's a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Her friends, the ones with whom she had shared cocktails and complaints about undesirable passengers, began to distance themselves. Her fall from grace was a social contagion they didn't want to catch. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her texts met with polite but evasive replies. Her identity had been so intrinsically linked to her job that without it, she had nothing to offer them. She was no longer Amelia Vance, senior flight attendant for Orion Atlantic. She was just Amelia Vance, unemployed. Within 3 months, her savings were gone. The eviction notice on her apartment door was the final brutal confirmation of her new reality. Swallowing her pride, a pride that had already cost her everything, she made the call she had been dreading. She called her parents in Ohio, the humble middle-class people whose world she had been so desperate to escape. Packing up her apartment was a painful exercise in disillusionment. The designer handbags and expensive shoes felt like relics from another life, hollow symbols of a status she no longer possessed. She sold what she could for a fraction of its original price. The rest she packed into cardboard boxes and shipped to her childhood home, a small 2-story house on a quiet suburban street, the very definition of the ordinary life she had fought so hard to leave behind. Back in Ohio, life was a monotonous grey landscape. Her father, a retired mechanic, and her mother, a part-time librarian, were kind, but bewildered by their daughter's spectacular fall. They didn't understand the world of first-class cabins and corporate takeovers. They only saw their daughter hollow-eyed and defeated, sleeping in her old teenage bedroom. Desperate for any income, she took the only job she could find, a barista at a high-end coffee shop in downtown Columbus, called The Daily Grind. The irony was not lost on her. She, who had once served vintage champagne on fine china, was now frothing milk and misspelling names on paper cups for $8 an hour, plus tips. The work was grueling and humbling. She had to learn to smile a real smile, not the practiced empty one from her past life. She had to learn to be patient, to serve everyone from hurried office workers to demanding students with the same level of respect. There was no hierarchy here. A customer was a customer. One dreary Tuesday morning, about a year after the incident, the bell above the coffee shop door chimed. Amelia was wiping down the counter, her mind a million miles away. "I'll have a large black coffee, please," a low, calm voice said. The voice was familiar, a deep, resonant baritone that sent a jolt of ice-cold dread through her entire body. She looked up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing on the other side of the counter, dressed in a simple, well-tailored business suit, was Marcus Thorne. For a moment, the world stopped. The hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of customers, the clatter of ceramic. It all faded into a roaring silence in Amelia's ears. It was him. His face was the same, composed, intelligent, his eyes holding that same unnerving stillness. He was in Columbus for a meeting, perhaps visiting one of the many tech startups that Phoenix Capital had invested in. Of all the coffee shops in all the cities in the world, he had walked into hers. He didn't seem to recognize her. And why would he? The woman in front of him bore little resemblance to the imperious flight attendant from Flight 702. Her once flawless chignon was now a simple, slightly frizzy ponytail. The designer uniform was replaced by a stained black apron over a cheap polo shirt. The confident, judgmental gleam in her eyes had been replaced by a weary, haunted emptiness. She was just another service worker, invisible in her mundanity. Panic seized her. Her first instinct was to run to hide in the stockroom and let a co-worker handle the order, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Where could she run to? This was her life now. This dingy, coffee-scented reality was the world she had built for herself, one bad decision at a time. Marcus was looking at his phone, waiting patiently. He hadn't made the connection. She had a choice. She could say nothing, take his money, give him his coffee, and let him walk out of her life forever. Or she could face the ghost that had haunted her for the past year. Taking a shaky breath, she turned to the espresso machine, her back to him. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a large paper cup. This was her moment of karma distilled into a single mundane transaction. She who had judged him for not being worthy of her service was now in a position where her only purpose was to serve him. She poured the coffee, the dark, steaming liquid, a stark contrast to the golden champagne she had once served. When she put the lid on the cup, her training, the muscle memory of 1,000 polite interactions kicked in. "That will be $3.50, sir," she said, her voice quiet and hoarse. She turned to face him, forcing herself to meet his eyes. As he looked up from his phone to hand her his credit card, his gaze fell on her face. For a second, there was nothing. Then a flicker of recognition. It wasn't a dramatic, sudden realization, but a slow, quiet dawning. His eyes narrowed slightly as he searched the archives of his memory, connecting the weary barista in front of him to the polished flight attendant from that fateful flight. Amelia saw the moment he remembered. His expression didn't change to anger or triumph. Instead, a complex, almost sad understanding settled on his features. He knew. He handed her the card. The name on it read M. Thorne. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and the brief contact felt like an electric shock. She ran the card the machine, beeping its approval, and handed it back to him, her eyes fixed on the countertop. The silence was deafening. He didn't take his coffee. He just stood there, watching her. "Amelia," he said, his voice soft, not a question, but a statement. She flinched, then nodded, unable to speak. All the anger, the resentment, the self-pity she had harbored for a year melted away, leaving only a profound, crushing shame. She started, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry. For that day. For how I treated you. There is no excuse. It was unacceptable. I was wrong." The apology, raw and unpracticed, hung in the air between them. It was the apology she should have given on the plane, the one she had been too proud and terrified to offer. Marcus Thorne looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the faded hope, the deep lines of humility carved by a year of hardship. He saw a woman who had lost everything and was now perhaps beginning to find something new. He picked up his coffee. "Thank you for the coffee," he said simply. Then he reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill, and placed it carefully in the tip jar on the counter. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said, his voice low and meant only for her. "Make the most of yours." And with that, he turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Amelia Vance standing behind the counter, staring at the crisp bill in the jar. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of self-pity, but of something else entirely. It was the painful, cleansing tear of release. His gesture wasn't one of pity, it was one of closure. He hadn't come to gloat or to seek revenge. He had simply offered a quiet acknowledgement of her humanity, the very thing she had denied him. It was a lesson in grace she would never forget. The karma she had received wasn't just about losing her job and her status. It was about being forced into a position where she could finally learn the humility she so desperately lacked. Her real punishment hadn't been the fall. It had been the long, arduous climb she now had to make back to being a decent human being. The $100 bill sat in the tip jar, a stark, crisp rectangle of green amidst a crumpled collection of ones and fives. For a long time, after Marcus Thorne had gone, Amelia couldn't move. She just stared at it, the image blurring as tears she hadn't realized were forming finally spilled over and streamed down her cheeks. They weren't the hot, angry tears of self-pity she had cried for months after her termination. These were different. They were quiet, cleansing tears of release, washing away the bitter sediment of a year's worth of resentment and shame. His words, "Everyone deserves a second chance. Make the most of yours," were not a pardon. They were a challenge to stop defining herself by the spectacular heights from which she had fallen, and to start building something new from the ground up. The coffee shop, which had been her purgatory, a daily penance for her sins, suddenly looked different. It was no longer a cage, but a crucible. The constant flow of people, the relentless demands, the humbling nature of the work, it was all an opportunity to practice being the person she now desperately wanted to become. The change in her was not instantaneous, but it was profound. The next morning, when a customer barked his complicated order at her, while on a loud phone call, her old instinct to sneer was replaced by a surprising wave of patience. She simply nodded, made the drink perfectly, and handed it to him with a quiet, "Have a better day." When a young mother struggled to manage a stroller and 2 crying children, Amelia left her post for a moment to help her find a table, and brought her a cup of water unasked. She started to learn the regulars' names, not as a tactic, but because she was genuinely curious about them. She learned that Mr. Henderson in the corner was a retired history professor writing a book, and that Sarah the young lawyer always needed an extra shot of espresso on Tuesdays, because that was her litigation day. She found a strange, quiet dignity in this work. She was no longer performing a role. She was providing a service. The genuine thank you from a grateful customer began to mean more to her than the silent, entitled nods she used to receive in the first-class cabin. Her identity was no longer tied to a pristine uniform and a position of petty authority, but to the simple human act of making someone's day just a little bit easier. The $100 bill from Marcus Thorne remained folded neatly in her wallet, a tangible reminder of the lesson in grace she had received from the man she had wronged. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was taking place at 38,000 feet, and in the corporate headquarters of Orion Atlantic Airways. The Marcus Thorne incident had sent shockwaves through the company's culture. It became the stuff of legend, a terrifying case study whispered in every training session. David Sterling, under the unwavering and watchful eye of his new chairman, had learned a critical lesson. A company's brand is not defined by its marketing budget or the quality of its champagne, but by the worst behavior it is willing to tolerate from its frontline staff. Marcus Thorne had insisted on a fundamental change. "I don't want performative apologies," he had told the board. "I want a systemic overhaul. I want a culture where the passenger in 42E is treated with the same intrinsic respect as the one in 1A. Their money is just as green. Their dignity is just as valuable." This mandate gave birth to the ground-up principle, a complete philosophical restructuring of Orion's service training, and the person chosen to lead it was Chloe. Her meteoric rise had surprised many, but not Marcus Thorne. He had seen in her a natural, unteachable empathy, the very soul the airline had been missing. Chloe, now director of in-flight experience, took to the role with a passion born from her own intimidating entry into the industry. Her training sessions were unlike any the airline had ever seen. She would stand before a room of new, eager flight attendants and say, "Let me tell you a story. It's about our most expensive customer service failure. It didn't cost us a lawsuit. It didn't result in a viral video. It almost cost us our soul." She would then anonymously recount the story of a senior attendant who judged a man by his hoodie, never mentioning Amelia's name, but painting a vivid picture of the arrogance and the fallout. That man, she would conclude, now owns this company. He didn't fire her out of anger. The system fired her because she was a liability to the values we now hold sacred. Your job isn't to be a gatekeeper of luxury. It's to be a guardian of human dignity. That is the Orion standard. She introduced modules on unconscious bias de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Role-playing exercises now included scenarios like assisting a passenger with a disability, comforting a nervous flyer, or handling a complaint with grace instead of defensiveness. The airline's new motto, visible on posters in every crew lounge, was simple: "Kindness is our trajectory." 2 years after her life had been completely reset, Amelia was perfecting a latte foam heart when the bell on the coffee shop door chimed. A woman in a sharply tailored Orion Atlantic management uniform stepped in, looking at the menu. Amelia's own heart gave a familiar jolt. It was Chloe. She looked polished, poised, and exuded a calm authority. Chloe ordered a black tea, and as she looked up to pay her eyes, met Amelia's. Recognition dawned, followed by a moment of profound, shared awkwardness. The last time they had seen each other, one was a queen in her cabin, the other an intimidated novice. Now their roles, their entire worlds had been inverted. "Amelia Chloe," said her voice, gentle, breaking the silence. Chloe Amelia replied, a small, genuine smile forming on her lips. The shame and envy she might once have felt were gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "Wow, you look important." Chloe laughed, a warm, unaffected sound. "Just busy. I heard about what you're doing here. Congratulations on, well, everything." Amelia knew she wasn't talking about the promotion to director. She was talking about her survival, her redemption. "Thank you," Amelia said. "It's been a journey, but a necessary one. I'm happy for you, Chloe. Truly. I always knew you were too good for that job in the best way. You were kind." They spoke for a few minutes, bridging the chasm of time and experience that separated them. Before leaving, Chloe paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know this might be too soon or just plain unwelcome, so feel free to say no," she began carefully. "But we're hiring ground staff, check-in agents at JFK. It's not glamorous, the pay isn't what you were used to, and the customers can be challenging. But the company is different now. We value experience, but more than that, we value people who understand the importance of a second chance. It's part of our new charter, a principle our chairman insisted on." Amelia stared at her, her breath catching in her throat. A job, a way back, not to the top, but to the beginning, to the ground. The symbolism was overwhelming. A year ago, her pride would have recoiled in horror. A check-in agent, after everything she had been, but she was no longer that person. She understood now that dignity wasn't in the role, but in how you performed it. "I'd like that," Chloe Amelia said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. I would like that very much. A few months later, Amelia Vance once again pinned the Orion Atlantic wings to her uniform. The fabric was a standard polyester blend, not the tailored wool of her old life. The wings were silver, not gold. She stood behind the bustling check-in counters at JFK, a place she had once strode past without a glance. Her domain was no longer a hushed, exclusive cabin, but the loud, chaotic, democratic expanse of the departures hall. Her first few weeks were a lesson in humility. She dealt with crying babies, overweight baggage, missed connections, and frayed tempers. But she handled it all with a grace she never knew she possessed. Her past was a constant, invisible companion, reminding her with every interaction of the cost of a single sneer, a single dismissive glance. One crisp autumn afternoon, a tall, broad-shouldered man approached her counter. He was wearing a simple charcoal grey hoodie and looked weary, his face etched with the fatigue of a long work week. He was flying to London, in economy. He was a contractor. He mentioned going to see his daughter who was studying abroad. He was flustered, worried his bag was a few pounds overweight. The old Amelia would have sighed with theatrical impatience. She would have quoted the baggage fee with a clipped, unforgiving tone. She would have made him feel small and foolish. The new Amelia looked at him and saw not a problem, but a person. A father, tired and anxious, just trying to get across the ocean to see his child. She gave him the warmest, most genuine smile of her life. "Welcome to Orion Atlantic," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "Don't you worry about the bag. We'll make it work. Just a pound or two over is no problem at all. Let's get you on your way." She checked him in with swift efficiency, found him an aisle seat so he could stretch his legs, and printed his boarding pass. As she handed it to him, she leaned forward slightly. "I hope you have a wonderful reunion with your daughter," she said. The man's tired face broke into a relieved, grateful smile. "Thank you." He said the words full of sincere appreciation. "Thank you so much." As he walked away towards security, Amelia watched him go, a profound sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had finally found her wings again. She wasn't soaring above the clouds in a gilded cage. She was on the ground at the starting line of 1,000 different journeys, giving each one the best possible takeoff. She finally understood that true service, true status, had nothing to do with the seat you occupy, but with the respect you give freely and to everyone. Her new trajectory was not about altitude, but about attitude. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was truly flying. The story of Amelia Vance and Marcus Thorne is a powerful reminder that what we wear or where we come from has no bearing on our true worth. It's a lesson about humility, respect, and the quiet, devastating power of underestimating someone. True karma isn't always a loud, dramatic explosion. Sometimes it's a slow, quiet unraveling that forces us to confront the person we've become and rebuild from the ground up. In a world that's so quick to judge on appearances, this story challenges us to look deeper, to lead with kindness, and to remember that the person in front of us might just own the plane. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment of karmic justice or an act of judgment that backfired spectacularly? Share your story with our community. And please don't forget to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and make you think. Thank you for listening.